the steamboat Marybelle churned through the muddy waters of the Mississippi, carrying Cordelia Cora Blacksmith and her 2 children toward their new life in Hartwell's Landing, Missouri. 11-year-old Josephine pressed her face against the grimy window while 8-year-old Frederick clutched his wooden toy train, both children unaware that their mother's calloused hands trembled as she reread Captain Wesley Hartwell's last letter. The spring of 1884 had brought unusual rains, and Cora noticed how the river ran higher and angrier than her father's engineering journals had ever described. Her carpet bag contained not just clothes and hope, but also her father's detailed notes on hydraulic engineering knowledge that would prove more valuable than gold in the days ahead. As the boat rounded the bend where Hartwell's Landing should have appeared in all its promised prosperity, Cora's heart sank at the sight of a town half drowned in Chaplucalard floodwater. The town that Wesley had described in his letters as a jewel on the river now resembled a collection of broken toys scattered by a giant child's tantrum. Buildings leaned at impossible angles, their foundations undermined by the relentless current that had raged through the main street only 2 weeks before. Debris hung from telegraph wires like macabre bunting, and the smell of river mud and decay hung heavy in the humid air. The few residents who had remained picked through the wreckage with the methodical desperation of people who had lost everything but hadn't yet accepted it. Mayor Thaddeus Cromwell stood on the remaining dry patch near the depot, his usual politician's smile replaced by the hollow stare of a man watching his dreams dissolve like sugar in the rain. "You must be Wesley's intended," Cromwell said when Cora disembarked with her children, his voice carrying the flat tone of a funeral director. The mayor's clothes were clean, but his boots were caked with mud, and his eyes held the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure. Behind him, a small group of survivors had gathered, women with hollow cheeks and men with shoulders bent by defeat, all looking at Cora with a mixture of pity and curiosity. "I'm afraid I have difficult news, Mrs. Blacksmith," he continued, removing his hat and running weathered fingers through thinning hair. The formal way he spoke her name told Cora everything before he could finish. Wesley Hartwell was dead, drowned trying to save the town's grain supply during the height of the flood. Before we continue, leave your like, share our story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. The news hit Cora like a physical blow. Not because she had loved Wesley, their correspondence had been practical rather than romantic, but because it meant her carefully constructed plan for her family's future had crumbled as surely as the town's foundations. Frederick began to cry, not understanding why the strange man's words made his mother's face turn pale, while Josephine squeezed Cora's hand with fierce protectiveness. Mayor Cromwell explained that Wesley had died 2 days after the flood, his body found tangled in the ruins of the grain elevator he'd tried to save. And now the county was pressuring everyone to abandon Hartwell's Landing and resettle elsewhere. The irony wasn't lost on Cora that she had traveled 800 miles to become a widow before she had even become a wife, carrying her children toward a future that no longer existed in a town that barely existed either. As Mayor Cromwell led them through the devastated main street, Cora's trained eye began cataloging the destruction with the clinical precision her father had taught her. The flood had risen nearly 12 feet above normal river level, she estimated, noting the watermarks on the few buildings still standing, and the pattern of debris deposition that told the story of hydraulic forces and engineering failure. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Water always finds the weakness, Cordelia, and it exploits that weakness until everything fails." The town's original builders had chosen the site for its proximity to the river, never considering that the river might one day choose to reclaim the land. Children's toys bobbed in stagnant pools while adults argued in hushed tones about salvage rights and insurance claims that would never come. That first night, Cora and her children slept in the town's makeshift shelter, the upper floor of Brennan's general store, which had survived because it sat on slightly higher ground and had been built with better foundations. The air was thick with the whispered conversations of displaced families, the soft crying of children, and the constant scratch of pencils on paper as people tried to calculate losses that couldn't be quantified in mere dollars. Cora lay awake, listening to the river's continued murmur, no longer the friendly sound of commerce and transportation, but now a threatening whisper, promising future destruction. Her father's engineering notebooks pressed against her ribs through her corset, and she found herself thinking not about what the town had lost, but about what it could become with the right knowledge and determination. Morning brought a town meeting in the skeletal remains of the Methodist Church, where Mayor Cromwell presented the county's official position. Hartwell's Landing should be abandoned. Its remaining residents relocated to higher, safer communities inland. The mayor's voice carried resignation as he read from official documents, explaining how the county would provide modest assistance for families willing to start over elsewhere. Most of the 37 remaining residents nodded wearily, exhausted by loss, to imagine fighting both the river and bureaucracy. But as Cora listened to the chorus of defeat, she felt something stirring in her chest that she hadn't experienced since her father's death. The engineer's instinct to solve problems rather than flee from them. When Cromwell asked if anyone objected to the abandonment plan, every eye in the room turned to stare at the woman who slowly, deliberately, raised her hand. "I object," Cora said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her knees as she stood before the assembly. "This town can be rebuilt, and rebuilt better than before, if we're willing to learn from what the river has taught us." The room erupted in murmurs of disbelief and anger. Who was this stranger, this failed mail-order bride, to tell them how to respond to their tragedy? Mayor Cromwell's eyebrows rose in polite skepticism, while several men exchanged glances that clearly questioned her sanity. But Cora pressed on, pulling her father's leather-bound notebook from her bag and explaining that she possessed knowledge of hydraulic engineering that could protect the town from future floods. Her choice to speak meant abandoning any hope of quiet resettlement. She was now committed to either succeeding spectacularly or failing in front of everyone, who had already lost everything. The reaction was swift and largely negative. "Engineering knowledge don't grow crops or raise children," scoffed Thomas Brennan, the store owner whose building had housed them all. Several women whispered behind their hands about the presumption of a newcomer trying to tell them how to handle their own affairs, while the men's skepticism was written clearly on their sun-weathered faces. Only one person seemed intrigued by Cora's proposal: Solomon Washington, a tall, dignified man whose skilled hands bore the calluses of a master carpenter and whose intelligent eyes suggested depths of knowledge earned through both formal learning and bitter experience. As the crowd's murmurs grew louder and more dismissive, Solomon stepped forward and asked quietly, "What exactly are you proposing, Mrs. Blacksmith?" Cora opened her father's notebook to a detailed diagram of levee construction and flood control systems, her finger tracing the careful mathematical calculations that had guided her father's work on the Illinois River 15 years earlier. "We rebuild the town on higher ground," she explained, "but we also build a proper levee system with controlled spillways that will direct floodwater away from homes and businesses." The technical terms sounded strange in the musty air of the damaged church, foreign concepts in a room full of people who understood river behavior through experience rather than equations. She explained how her father had designed similar systems in Illinois, creating communities that had withstood floods that destroyed their unprepared neighbors. Mayor Cromwell listened with growing interest, his politician's instincts recognizing that a successful flood control project could bring federal attention and investment to their struggling county. The debate that followed was heated but civil, with practical concerns mixing with desperate hope. How would they finance such an ambitious project? Where would they live while construction proceeded? Could they trust their futures to theories written in books rather than wisdom earned through generations of river life? Cora answered each question with the patient precision her father had taught her, sketching rough diagrams on the church's damaged wall and explaining how the initial investment would be repaid through protection of crops, buildings, and lives. Solomon Washington asked the most informed questions, demonstrating a knowledge of construction techniques that surprised everyone except perhaps himself. As the morning stretched toward noon, Cora realized that she was no longer simply defending a proposal. She was negotiating the terms of her new life and her children's future. By the meeting's end, 17 families had committed to staying and attempting Cora's ambitious reconstruction plan, forming a community bound not by blood or a long acquaintance, but by shared desperation and tentative hope. Mayor Cromwell agreed to petition the county for a construction loan, while Solomon Washington volunteered to serve as head builder if Cora would provide the engineering guidance. The decision transformed Cora from a displaced widow into the unlikely leader of a reconstruction effort that would either save the town or provide a more spectacular failure than the original flood. As families began making lists of immediate needs and long-term goals, Cora felt her children's futures shifting from uncertainty to possibility. Though she understood that the hardest work still lay ahead, The first week of reconstruction work revealed both the enormity of the task and the character of the people who had chosen to attempt it. Cora established her headquarters in a partially damaged building that became part engineering office, part schoolroom for the children, and part community meeting space. Solomon Washington proved to be not just a skilled carpenter but also a gifted organizer who could translate Cora's technical specifications into practical work. Assignments for volunteers with varying levels of construction experience. The other families gradually warmed to Cora's presence, particularly the women who appreciated having another mother to share childcare duties and domestic challenges. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, Wesley's elderly mother, initially kept her distance from the woman who had come to marry her dead son, but eventually found herself drawn to Cora's quiet competence and genuine affection for her children. The physical work was backbreaking, but it created bonds between people who had previously been merely neighbors. Men who had competed for the same customers now worked side by side hauling stones for the foundation of the new levee, while women who had gossiped about each other's housekeeping now shared cooking duties and watched each other's children. Josephine proved particularly helpful as a messenger and record keeper. Her quick mind grasping the basics of surveying, and her neat handwriting recording measurements and material inventories. Frederick found his own role entertaining the younger children and helping elderly residents with simple tasks, his cheerful nature earning him adoption as everyone's honorary grandchild. The work was slow and frequently frustrating, but each day's progress created visible proof that the impossible might be merely difficult. Cora's technical knowledge proved invaluable, but she quickly learned that successful engineering required more than mathematical precision. The Missouri soil had different characteristics than the Illinois riverbanks her father had worked with, requiring adjustments to foundation depths and drainage systems, local weather patterns, seasonal flood cycles, and even the river's changing course had to be incorporated into her calculations. Through careful observation and consultation with longtime residents, Solomon Washington became her primary partner in this process of adaptation, his practical construction experience complementing her theoretical training in ways that produced innovative solutions to unexpected problems. Together, they developed a building technique that combined her father's hydraulic principles with local materials and traditional craftsmanship, creating something entirely new. The children's adjustment to their new circumstances proved easier than Cora had dared hope. Josephine flourished in her role as assistant engineer, learning to use surveying instruments and helping check calculations that would determine the community's survival. The other children accepted Frederick's slightly different speech patterns and quiet nature, including him in their games and adventures without the cruel exclusion Cora had feared. Both children began calling Solomon Washington Uncle Sol, a relationship that filled a gap in their lives that Cora hadn't fully realized existed. The informal adoption of her family by the broader community represented something deeper than mere kindness. It suggested that belonging could be earned through contribution rather than inherited, through blood or marriage. As spring turned toward summer, the reconstruction work began attracting attention from neighboring communities and even county officials, who had initially dismissed the project as doomed folly. Newspaper reporters arrived to document the unusual sight of a woman engineer directing a major construction project, though their articles focused more on the novelty of her gender than the innovation of her techniques. The attention brought both welcome resources and unwelcome complications, skilled workers seeking employment, but also critics questioning whether such an ambitious project could succeed without professional oversight from established engineering firms. Cora found herself defending not just her technical proposals but also her right to implement them, a battle that required political skills she was still developing. The moment that sealed Cora's commitment to Hartwell's Landing came during a summer evening when the community gathered to celebrate the completion of the levee's first section. Children played in the construction area that would soon be protected by the flood control system, while adults shared food and stories in the golden light of sunset. Josephine and Frederick ran laughing with their new friends, their faces bright with happiness. Cora hadn't seen since before their father's death 3 years earlier. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell sat beside Cora on a pile of construction timber, watching the children play, and quietly said, "Wesley would have been proud to see what you've done for his town." The words released something in Cora's chest that she had been holding tight. Since the day she arrived, the recognition that this place and these people had become her home not through marriage, but through shared labor and mutual care. Summer brought the first serious test of both the construction work and the community's cohesion. When heavy rains in the upper watershed caused a minor flood that reached the town's previous flood level, the new levee system held perfectly, directing the excess water through carefully planned spillways and protecting the construction areas and temporary shelters. But the success created its own problems. Neighboring communities, whose leaders had mocked the project, now demanded access to Cora's engineering plans. While some of Hartwell's Landing's own residents began questioning whether they should share their hard-won knowledge with people who had offered no help during the difficult months of rebuilding, the flood's aftermath revealed that success could be as challenging to manage as failure, particularly when that success attracted the attention of people with their own agendas. The technical challenges of the second phase of construction pushed both Cora's knowledge and Solomon's skills to their limits. The main levee required precisely calculated curves and angles that would deflect flood pressure without creating dangerous backwater effects upstream or downstream. Each section had to be completed with mathematical precision, yet adapted to the irregular terrain and varying soil conditions of the actual site. Working by lantern light after the community's children were asleep, Cora and Solomon spent hours reviewing calculations, adjusting plans, and solving problems that no textbook had anticipated. Their partnership had evolved from polite cooperation to genuine intellectual friendship, each contributing knowledge and perspectives that made their combined efforts more effective than either could have achieved alone. The approaching autumn brought news that would test everyone's resolve. County officials announced that funding for the reconstruction project would be cut if work wasn't completed by the end of October. Before winter weather made further construction impossible, the deadline seemed impossible given the amount of work remaining, but abandoning the project now would mean losing everything they had invested in both labor and hope. Families held urgent meetings to decide whether to push forward with inadequate time and resources, or accept partial completion and hope it would be sufficient for smaller floods. The debate revealed the deep bonds that had formed over the months of shared work. As people weighed individual family security against collective community survival, Cora's response to the deadline crisis demonstrated the leadership skills she had developed through months of managing both technical and human challenges. Rather than accepting the county's timeline as immutable, she proposed a modified construction plan that would complete the essential flood control elements while deferring some of the planned amenities to future phases. She also suggested approaching the problem collectively, with all families contributing extra labor during the remaining weeks in exchange for shared ownership of the completed project. The proposal required sacrifices from everyone, but it also offered something that individual family efforts couldn't achieve: genuine security through community cooperation. Solomon Washington endorsed the plan enthusiastically, and his support carried weight with residents who had learned to trust his judgment. The final weeks of construction created a temporary suspension of normal life as every adult and most children contributed whatever skills and strength they possessed to meeting the October deadline. Cora worked 18-hour days moving between construction sites, checking quality, solving problems, and maintaining morale when exhaustion threatened to derail the entire effort. Josephine and Frederick adapted to their mother's constant absence by becoming integral parts of the community's informal childcare network, helping younger children and assisting elderly residents with daily tasks. The intensity of the shared effort created bonds that would last lifetimes, as people discovered reserves of strength and generosity they hadn't known they possessed. By the third week of October, it became clear that they would either complete the project on schedule or collapse from exhaustion in the attempt. As the deadline approached, unexpected help arrived in the form of skilled workers from neighboring communities, who had decided that Hartwell's Landing's success would benefit the entire region. These volunteers brought not just extra hands but also specialized knowledge of masonry, metalwork, and other technical skills that accelerated the final construction phases. Their presence transformed the project from a purely local effort into a regional demonstration of cooperative engineering, attracting attention from state officials and engineering professionals, who began documenting the innovative techniques being developed. The outside support validated Cora's vision, while creating new pressures to succeed that extended far beyond the original community's boundaries. 3 days before the county deadline, a catastrophic equipment failure threatened to derail the entire project when the community's only steam-powered construction crane broke down while lifting the final capstone sections of the main levee. The mechanical failure occurred at the worst possible moment, with critical work incomplete and no time to obtain replacement equipment through normal channels. Local residents with mechanical knowledge worked desperately to repair the damage, but the crane's boiler had suffered internal damage that seemed beyond their capabilities to fix. The crisis forced everyone to confront the possibility that months of backbreaking labor and financial sacrifice might end in failure due to a mechanical problem completely outside their control, testing both their technical resourcefulness and their collective determination. The solution came from an unexpected source when Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell revealed that her late husband had been not just a river pilot, but also a skilled mechanic who had maintained a workshop behind their damaged house. The workshop contained tools and spare parts that Solomon, Washington, and the other mechanically inclined residents could use to fabricate replacement components for the broken crane. Working around the clock with improvised materials and traditional blacksmithing techniques, they managed to create functional substitutes for the damaged boiler parts. The repair work required combining traditional craftsmanship with industrial engineering, producing a hybrid machine that represented the same creative adaptation that characterized the entire reconstruction project. By the morning of the second-to-last day, the crane was operational again. Though everyone understood, it was held together more by determination and prayer than by proper engineering. The final day of construction work stretched from before dawn until well after dark, with every resident participating in whatever capacity their age and strength allowed. Children carried water and small tools. Elderly residents prepared food and provided encouragement, while adults focused every ounce of energy on completing the remaining work before the county's midnight deadline. Cora moved constantly between work sites, checking quality, and coordinating the complex sequence of tasks that had to be completed in precise order. The community's months of shared labor had created an almost telepathic cooperation that allowed people to anticipate needs and coordinate efforts without lengthy discussion. As evening approached, it became clear that they would finish the essential work with perhaps an hour to spare, assuming no major problems occurred. The project's completion at 11:17 p.m. on October 31st created a celebration that continued until dawn, with exhausted residents gathering around bonfires to share food, stories, and the profound satisfaction of achieving something that had seemed impossible. County officials who arrived to inspect the work found construction that exceeded their specifications and incorporated innovative features that would become models for future flood control projects throughout the region. The technical success was important, but the human success was even more significant. 37 families had not just survived disaster but had created something better than what they had lost. Cora stood with her children, watching the celebration, understanding that she had found more than physical safety for her family. She had found a community where contribution mattered more than background, where intelligence was valued regardless of gender, and where home was something created rather than inherited. Winter brought the community's first opportunity to enjoy the fruits of their labor as families moved into new homes built on higher ground and protected by the completed flood control system. The houses were simple but solid, designed with the practical efficiency that had characterized the entire project. Cora's own home included a small office where she could continue developing engineering plans for other communities facing similar challenges, while Josephine and Frederick each had their own rooms for the first time in their lives. The physical comfort was welcome, but more important was the psychological security of living in a place specifically designed to withstand the natural forces that had destroyed the original town. For the first time since arriving in Missouri, Cora allowed herself to believe that her children's future was secure. The crucial revelation came in December when a delegation of federal engineers arrived to study Hartwell's Landing's flood system as part of a nationwide survey of innovative flood management techniques. Their leader, Colonel James Mitchell of the Army Corps of Engineers, was impressed not just by the technical sophistication of the design, but by the community-based construction methods that had made the project economically feasible. He offered Cora a position as a consulting engineer for similar projects throughout the Mississippi Valley, recognizing that her combination of technical knowledge and community organizing skills represented exactly what federal flood control efforts needed. The offer provided validation of her work while opening possibilities for influence that extended far beyond Hartwell's Landing's boundaries. though accepting would require difficult choices about her family's future and her obligations to the community that had become her home. The winter months also brought personal revelations as the intensity of construction work gave way to the quieter rhythms of normal community life. Cora's friendship with Solomon Washington had deepened into something more complex, a partnership that combined intellectual collaboration, mutual respect, and growing personal affection. Their relationship challenged social conventions of the time, but the community that had learned to value practical contribution over social expectations proved remarkably accepting of unconventional partnerships. Josephine and Frederick had already begun treating Solomon as a father figure, and his quiet, steady presence provided stability that complemented Cora's dynamic energy. The possibility of creating a family based on choice rather than convention represented the same kind of innovation that had characterized the engineering project. Spring's arrival brought the first real test of the flood control system when heavy rains created conditions similar to those that had destroyed the original town. The levee system performed exactly as designed, channeling excess water through carefully planned spillways while protecting homes and businesses built on the elevated sites. Residents gathered on the protected high ground to watch the controlled flood flow harmlessly past their community, understanding that they were witnessing proof of their collective wisdom and hard work. The successful flood management attracted visitors from throughout the region, establishing Hartwell's Landing as a model for other communities facing similar challenges. The town that had nearly died was being reborn as a center of innovation and expertise. The success created new challenges as neighboring communities requested Cora's assistance with their own flood control projects, while government officials pressed her to accept the federal consulting position that would take her away from Hartwell's Landing for months at a time. The demands forced her to confront questions she had been avoiding. What were her obligations to the community that had accepted her versus her responsibilities to use her knowledge to help other communities facing similar threats? Could she maintain her family's stability while accepting professional opportunities that required extensive travel? The decisions were complicated by her growing relationship with Solomon and her children's deep attachment to the community that had become their home. The crisis that would transform everything came in late spring when unseasonably heavy rains created flood conditions that exceeded even Cora's most pessimistic projections. The levee system held, but barely, with several sections showing stress cracks that threatened catastrophic failure if the water rose another foot. For 3 days, the entire community worked in shifts to reinforce the threatened sections while evacuating to higher ground as a precaution. Cora barely slept during the emergency, moving constantly between threatened areas, calculating stress loads, and coordinating repairs that had to be completed while fighting the river's relentless pressure. The crisis tested not just the engineering but also the community bonds that had been forged during construction, as people risked their lives to protect infrastructure that protected everyone else. When the water finally receded, everyone understood that they had survived not just a natural disaster but a test of their collective character and commitment. The aftermath of the spring flood crisis established Cora's reputation as one of the region's foremost experts on flood management, but more importantly, it solidified her position as an integral leader of the Hartwell's Landing community. Federal engineers who came to study the levee system's performance during the extreme conditions found innovations that would be incorporated into flood control projects throughout the Mississippi Valley. State officials offered funding for expansion of the system to protect neighboring communities, while newspapers throughout the Midwest published articles about the lady engineer who had saved a dying town. The attention was gratifying but also overwhelming, as Cora struggled to balance professional opportunities with personal responsibilities to her family and adopted community. The flood control system Cora and Solomon built became both a technical and human triumph. What began as desperate reconstruction evolved into a model of regional cooperation, with Hartwell's Landing and neighboring towns weathering the Great Flood of 1885 with minimal damage, while unprotected areas downstream lay devastated. The crisis proved the power of collective effort, drawing the attention of federal policymakers, who saw in their work the seeds of a national approach to disaster management. As recognition spread, Cora was invited to Washington and offered positions that few women of her generation could imagine. Yet she chose to remain rooted in Hartwell's Landing. balancing federal consulting with her life in the community that had become her true home. With Solomon's expanding construction business, their children thriving, and their partnership formalized in marriage, the family embodied the stability and strength that had once seemed impossible when Cora first arrived as a widow with nothing but her father's notebooks. By the spring of 1886, Hartwell's Landing stood transformed into a thriving model of resilience and cooperation. Inspiring projects across the Mississippi Valley, Cora had grown from a displaced widow into a nationally respected engineer, Solomon from a carpenter into a regional builder, and their children into young leaders, shaped by the values of knowledge and service. As Cora looked out from the levee, over the river that once threatened to destroy them, she saw not just safety but a lasting truth, that security is built through shared labor, mutual commitment, and the courage to transform hardship into hope for generations to come.